Hello, my dearest channel members. We are back with another Social Stud Live post show. Yeah, raise the roof. Let's party. So today we're going to be doing something I started a while ago, but never ended up continuing. I guess I just forgot about it. Not because I have anything against the series. The first episode was pretty fun, and I think there's a lot of potential for me to learn and review stuff about government and politics by checking out this. Well, the series is Crash Course Government and Politics. I started it a while ago. Before I was doing live streams, I did episode 1, and it was going to be a members only react series. And I wanted to continue that. I just never got around to doing episode 2. So we're going to be doing episode 2 and almost certainly episode 3 today, which should be a lot of fun. So this is centered around the US government, which is kind of a mess. It's got some good stuff to it, but generally I have complaints all over the place about the way that our government is set up, but I think that makes it really interesting. I don't know what my ideal government necessarily is, but I know the elements that I don't like. The bicameral Congress, I get it. But I also have some mixed feelings about certain elements of it. So I think there's a good opportunity to talk about some of this stuff. This is something where my opinion on it has developed a lot over time and probably has a lot of room to be moved on it. But I guess we'll see where we go with this. So we'll start with episode 2 and I'll chime in here and there.
Hi, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government.
Hi, Craig.
It's been a dream of mine to be on Crash Course since I was a little kid. Speaking of acting like a little kid, today we're going to talk about the U.S. Congress, which, according to the Constitution, is the most important branch of government. That was probably written by Congress. It wasn't. They didn't exist yet. So when I say that Congress is supposed to be the most important branch of government, I'm talking about the national government, not the state government. There's a difference, okay? I know this because the Constitution, which consists of 7 articles and 28 amendments, mentions Congress first. In fact, right after the preamble, the very first section of the very first article, which is helpfully labeled Article 1, Section 1, says this: "All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives." So right away,
it's a really interesting document we're talking about here because it was written by people who wanted to shift the balance of power towards the federal government, meaning the national government, the government that spans across the different states, as opposed to the state governments, which prior to that held a lot of the actual power. There's the federal government, which in theory should have held power over the states, but in practice didn't really have the means of enforcing that power. They didn't have any significant taxation power early on before we adopted the Constitution that we currently have. It was kind of a mess, and it put a lot of power in the hands of the states, which could be good in some ways, but in a lot of ways doesn't make for a big, strong, cohesive unit where these allied states work together for larger interests than their own, you know?
The Constitution sets up a 2-house legislature with a Senate and a House of Representatives. The Latin word for this is bicameral, and I promise I'll quit with the Latin now. I didn't really say much Latin, but just once, but I won't say anymore.
A lot of government and legal jargon does come from old, antiquated Latin terms, and stuffy types will often throw a lot of Latin at you, but I don't personally like using, bicameral. It's kind of one of those terms that has been so very much integrated into our regular conversation. I didn't even really think of it as a Latin term, but I try to avoid a lot of the stuffy, pretentious Latin terms because I think it makes a lot of it less accessible. Not as many people are going to be as willing to listen or understand it if you're using language that feels so exclusive. And that's so often what Latin is at this point. Though it's a very important thing to know. Just throwing a bunch of Latin stuff out there, it kind of makes you seem a little unrelatable.
That's pretty catchy. So let's start with the House of Representatives because it's a little easier. In order to serve in the House, you have to be 25 years old, a citizen for 7 years, and a resident of the state that you hope to represent. I'd like to think that I represent a state of enjoyment. Vote for me. 2015. Representation is determined by population. No state has fewer than one. Vermont, North and South Dakota, Wyoming, and Alaska each have one. And the most populous state, California, has 52. Right now, there are 435 members of the House of Representatives. The Senate has 2 senators from each state for a total of 100. To be a senator, you must be at least 30 years old, a citizen for 9 years, and a resident of the state you hope to represent. Originally, senators were chosen by the state legislatures, which meant that they tended to be politically important members of a state's elite class. But this changed with the 17th Amendment, and now senators are elected by the people, just like representatives. I'm going to explain how the 2 houses of the legislature...
That is a very important detail when you study history, because the Senate was so separated from the ordinary people for the longest time. It really was a place of people with connections, and still is in a lot of ways, but they kind of have to work around it and get the support of the people, even though they might not have the most organic groundswell of support from the people. They find ways, because if you're wealthy enough, you can buy people's attention. But generally, the House of Representatives is like the democratic institution, while the Senate is kind of a limitation on democracy, because the founders, they really feared democracy. They didn't think of like a really strong democracy as a good thing. They believed in some democratic principles, but they didn't want Joe Schmo, ordinary person voting. They wanted it to be kind of the more well-off people who had land and, in a sense, like a vested interest in the future of the country and all that, because you had to have property in order to have a vested interest in the country. Like, if you didn't have property and you had political power, you might just use that power to take property away from the nice rich people who have that power. So the foundations of this is not as nice as we tend to like to think of it now.
Legislature actually legislate in a later episode. I'll have a bigger beard, probably. But now I'm going to point out a few of the ways that they are different. Ultimately, the houses do the same thing, make laws, but the Constitution grants certain specific powers to each house. Let's look at those powers in the thought bubble. The House of Representatives is given the power to impeach the president and other federal officials. This can be confusing because people tend to think that impeaching means kicking the official out of office, but it doesn't. The House
This, I don't know when this series came out. It's definitely before the Donald Trump stuff. I think people learned a lot about impeachment and the process during the Donald Trump impeachments, because I think a lot of people thought this. But I think a lot less people think of it that way now, because we've had such an open, more recent thing that like everybody was paying attention to. So this may not, if this was made today, need as much clarification as it does here, which is interesting. I live in an interesting time.
Impeaches an official by deciding that that person has done something bad enough to bring him to trial. An impeachment is like a criminal indictment. Once the official is impeached, a trial happens in the Senate. If it's the president who's been impeached, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides. Otherwise, it's the Vice President. You don't let the VP preside over a presidential impeachment trial because he has a vested interest in seeing the president removed. The VP would become president. Duh. The second power that the House has is that they decide presidential elections if no candidate wins a majority of the Electoral College. I'll explain this later, but for now remember that this barely ever has happened ever. The third power that belongs specifically to the House is found in Article 1, Section 7. All bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives. This is pretty important because it means that any bill that raises taxes starts in the House. And if you know anything about America, you know that we care about taxes a lot.
It's really interesting. The makeup of that is so fun because it is generally the more democratic house. Therefore, it's easier for them to ask ordinary people for money because they are closer to the ordinary person than the senator has traditionally been. The senator is a little bit more high up. It's not that they're generally more important. It's just like Well, in some cases they are more important, but in a lot of ways, the House of Representatives is far more connected with the people based on its history of directly appealing to the people far longer.
So this power is huge, and it's sometimes called the power of the purse. The Senate has some important powers too. The first one I've already mentioned is that they hold impeachment trials. That doesn't happen very often at all. Another power the Senate has is to ratify treaties. This requires a 2/3 vote of the Senate. Most treaties you don't hear much about, except when the Senate refuses to ratify them, as it did, or didn't do, with the Treaty of Versailles. I totally would have ratified that treaty, just saying. The last significant power that belongs only to the Senate is the confirmation power. The Senate votes to confirm the appointment of executive officers that require Senate.
But the fact that they didn't ratify the Treaty of Versailles, that didn't necessarily kill the Treaty of Versailles. It kind of exposes how a lot of government actions, I guess, could be taken more as formalities. Though that's an interesting case because we're talking about like international relations where we're not always going to be on the same page with all the other countries, but it's more like what can be done and what can be enforced, and in the real world, how does this impact things? People can be against something, but if you can't enforce it or fight against it, then it doesn't really matter. If things are going to go the same way, whether you sign something or not, it kind of hurts the legitimacy and the perception of a political office or entity, but it doesn't it's not necessarily a game changer.
Senate confirmation. Some of these, like the cabinet secretaries,
but
are
not
obvious,
always.
but there are over 1,000 offices requiring Senate confirmation, including federal judges, and this is probably too many. Thanks, Thought Bubble. I love saying that. Yes! So those are the major differences between the two houses of the legislature. But why do we have two? And why did the framers of the Constitution make them different anyway? There are two categories of reason here, historical and practical. The historical reason for the two houses is that when the Constitution was being written, the framers couldn't agree on what type of legislature to have because they came from states with different interests. Delegates from states with large populations wanted legislators to be chosen based on the state's population so that their states would have, wait for it, more legislators and more power. This is called proportional representation. States with small populations understandably didn't want proportional representation. They favored equal representation in the legislature, which would give them equal power. Large states supported what was called the Virginia Plan, and small states wanted the new...
This is really interesting here. I come from a state that's on the smaller side, so inherently we would have wanted equal representation. So we'd have the same number of representatives as Virginia, even though Virginia has more people, let's say. That would, on the face of it, that makes a lot of sense, because these are all considered, in a lot of ways, separate political entities working together. So you're basing it on like the relationship between the states as single entities. However, it's weird today because the United States, in a lot of, it kind of feels goofy saying this, but we are more united than we once were. We consider ourselves to be Americans in a lot more than we consider ourselves to be, in my case, like a Rhode Islander or somebody from Massachusetts, or maybe not Texas. Maybe Texans consider them to be more Texan than Americans. I don't really know. But generally, people back then thought about themselves as members of their own state before they thought of themselves as members of, as Americans, as people of the United States. That might be a secondary thing. It's like if today somebody in Europe considered themselves an EU member before they considered themselves English. That would be kind of weird. That's not like the first bit of everybody's identity, typically. Well, that's kind of how it would have felt like back then if you considered yourself an American first, because they thought of it as just kind of this big union of states. It didn't have the same, I guess, unity that we have now, as like, yeah, we've, despite the fact that we feel divided a lot, we are all Americans, and we are Americans first in many cases.
New Jersey plan, and they argued over it until a compromise was reached. Since it was brokered by Connecticut's Roger Sherman, it was called the Connecticut Compromise, or more usually, the Great Compromise, because historians are really bad at naming things.
We do that a lot.
This war is 9 years long. Let's call it the 7 Years' War. That's actually genius. If you guessed that the compromise was an upper house with equal representation and a lower house with proportional representation, congratulations, you understand the Great Compromise. You don't win anything if you guessed it right. Actually, if you guessed it right, click here and watch me punch an eagle. So that's the historical reason for the two houses, but what about the practical reasons? One of the main reasons to divide the legislature and give the two houses different powers is to make it so that the legislature doesn't have too much power. How do we know that the framers wanted this? Because one of them, James...
That's not bad. Like, slowing down the process of governing can be good. It keeps them from making rash decisions. That, to a certain degree, I kind of get. These days, it feels like things are so stagnant, like they can't get anything done. But I kind of understand that the opposite could also be a problem. Like them making very quick decisions without considering broader implications, or just drowning out people from places that don't have the same level of representation. Like if the Senate were abolished, which I part of me wouldn't mind. I kind of understand some of the problems that could come during periods of concentrated power in like one political party. It could create such rapid change that could potentially be destructive. I get that that's possible. Generally, though, I'm not a huge fan of the Senate. I will come out and say that. Like, I get its purpose, but if the Senate disappeared tomorrow, I wouldn't be heartbroken.
James Madison told us in one of the Federalist Papers. In Federalist 51, Madison wrote, "In Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. The remedy for this inconveniency is to divide the legislature into different branches and to render them, by different modes of election and different principles of action, as little connected with each other as the nature of their common functions and their common dependence on the society will admit." James Madison might not have sounded like Foghorn Leghorn, but that's one of the theories. My theory. I say. Anyway, the idea that one house of the legislature can limit the power of the other house is called an intra-branch check. We'll look at this in more detail when we talk about checks and balances. In general, the framers of the Constitution were kind of obsessed with the idea that the government might have too much power. So we'll be seeing a lot of examples of how they tried to deal with this. So let's finish.
They were obsessed with that, but also, like I said, this is shifting towards giving the government power. Because before this, they had such little power that they felt the need to shift it towards having power. So we are moving in kind of like a centralizing power sort of direction compared to where they are before this. Though there are definitely some checks that they put in place. As you can tell with the bicameral legislature, it does slow down the process of government a little bit, puts more obstacles in the way of making legislation, which can be good. It's not always a bad thing that it forces you to foster greater cooperation in order to get things done. Even though I look at things today, it feels so bleak. But like, I get the purpose. I can kind of remove myself a little bit from the passions of today and kind of get the purpose. But it feels like half of the things that I try to say or think about saying, they feel silly right now. But I understand I'm in a time of great political tension, and that's not the only time you govern during. We got to get through this time of political tension one way or another, but you don't just build things for these points of extreme political tension. That's not the only thing that government is built for.
Finish up by looking at the reasons why the specific powers were given to each house. To do this, let me introduce my assistants, and by assistants, I really mean clones. Let's go to the clone zone! So I made these clones to help us understand these multi-sided issues. This is Senate clone, and this is House clone, and they're quite good looking, I might add. So you may have noticed, according to the Constitution, Senators are expected to be older than representatives, and although 30 isn't all that old today, it was in 1787 when the Constitution was written. This was because older people are wiser, or at least more experienced, and the framers wanted the Senate, which is sometimes called the upper house, to be more serious, august, dignified, and above all, deliberative than the House. It was
At this point, the ages are a bit arbitrary. I don't think they're ever going to really bother changing that. But now that you think about it, I don't think there's any reason why the ages would be different between the two, especially since the nature of how we view them has changed so much.
supposed to be more immune from the desires of the public, which the framers were kind of afraid of because of their unfortunate propensity to riot. One of the ways that the framers hoped to ensure this was by giving senators a 6-year term, which really would mean that they could ignore the rantings and ravings of their constituents for at least, 5 years at a time. Because the Senate is supposed to be the more deliberative body and the one that is more insulated from public opinion, they're the ones given the power to confirm public ministers and to ratify treaties. I guess they thought that, being older and wiser, senators would be better judges of character and better able to govern based on the sense of what is in the public interest.
So you can see why I kind of have beef with the existence of the Senate. I get the purpose. I keep saying that. I get the purpose. But there is something inherently undemocratic about the way that the Senate has been laid out. It got better from the beginning, but there is something inherently undemocratic that kind of bugs me. I feel like I'm don't laugh, a small d Democrat at heart, by which I mean not necessarily Democrats and Democratic Party, but I lean towards greater democracy as much as I think possible.
Sometimes the idea that a representative should govern based on what he thinks is best for the people rather than what they say they want is referred to as representative acting as a trustee. Which is another way of saying that the Senate is full of elitist snobs that don't care what their constituents want at all. In the House, representatives are supposed to take into consideration the desires of the people in their districts who voted for them, acting in the role of delegates. So the main way that the framers tried to ensure that representatives could be more responsive to their voters, other than having them directly elected by the voters instead of state legislatures, was to give them 2-year terms. This meant that they had to be responsive to the changing opinion of voters in their districts, otherwise they could easily be voted out of office. You don't want that. No way. Oh boy. Why they would be given the power of impeachment is sort of beyond me, but it totally makes sense to give the power of the purse to the branch of government that's closest to the people. After all, one thing that the government does that is directly related to almost everybody is taxes. So you want the most democratic body making decisions that have the most direct effect on people. Huh. Thanks, clones. So there you have it. That's
I
the
like
basics
the
of our
clones.
bicameral Congress, including the
That was
differences between
fun.
the two houses and why they are that way. I used Latin again. I'm sorry. Mea culpa. We'll be going into much
I
greater
didn't
detail
notice.
about how the two houses work together, or don't, in future episodes. But that's enough for now. Thanks for watching Crash Course. I'll see you next week. Crash Course Government and Politics is produced in association with PBS Digital Studios. Support for Crash Course U.S. Government comes from Vocal. Vocal supports nonprofits that use technology and media to advance social equity. Learn more about their mission and initiatives at vocal.org. Crash Course is made with the help of these nice people.
All right, so that was fun. I think I'm very excited to see how deep these go. With 50 episodes, I know I'm going to be learning a little bit more as time goes on. I actually feel far more comfortable in these early episodes than I think I'm going to be in the later ones, because a lot of what I focused on when I was getting my bachelor's and up until relatively recently is the early American Republic, as they are coming up with a lot of these ideas for the first time. So I'm actually pretty comfortable with this early stuff. I like it. The further down we get, I feel like I'm going to get more and more removed from my comfort zone, but I think that's good. So we'll try to put a dent in this series. Let's watch one more. Let's watch at least one more. I like this guy.
Hi,
He's
I'm
great.
Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics. And today I'm going to try to explain 2 fundamental concepts of American government that students and citizens often confuse: Team Jacob and Team Edward. Separation of powers and checks and balances. Team Jacob. So separation of powers is really simple. The national government is divided into three separate branches: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. I put them in this order because that's the way the Constitution has them, and I'm not going to argue with the Constitution, except for that stupid 3/5 of a person thing. So the legislative branch comes
Well,
first because
yeah.
it's supposed to be the most important branch. And Article 1 is the longest and most detailed.
So, one thing that's fun about the three branches of government, it kind of places the government in opposition to the other parts of the government. It's like the American government is designed to be less efficient, which has some negatives. Once again, it has some negatives, but there are some positives to that, especially if you feel that your government is not inherently working with your best interest in mind. You'd probably want to slow them down so that you're able to enact the change that you want and kind of sway the government before it changes too much in like the wrong direction.
Legislative branch comes
I
first
get it.
because it's supposed to be the most important branch. And Article 1 is the longest and most detailed of the 7 articles in the Constitution. The main job of the legislature is to make laws. The secondary job is to say, no, it's your fault. No, it's your fault. No, it's your fault. I'm going home. I have to campaign. Then we have the executive branch, and here the Constitution is a little less helpful. Article 2, Section 1 states,
The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America.
So the term president is a very interesting thing when they first established it, because it's such a, like, now president actually means a lot. All sorts of countries have presidents. But back then, the president could be anything. This could be the president of your local volunteer organization, the president of your book club, president of, it's just somebody who presides over something in its more literal meaning. They aren't, it doesn't give any implications that it's a strong executive. But in the United States, the president is a pretty darn strong executive, though a lot of the time they like you to believe that they're not. They're more powerful than they often let on.
The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America.
The executive branch is obviously more than just one guy or girl. The executive branch is in charge of executing the laws, which basically means carrying them out. So the president is like the CEO of the U.S., making sure that the government governs. Interestingly, the president's power as executive is found in the oath of office.
I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, and will to the best of my ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Wait, Stan, I just gave the presidential oath of office, so I'm president now, right? Totally. Oh, elections. Yeah, we didn't have those. Last, and in the eyes of many people, least, is the judicial branch. The job of the judiciary, also sometimes...
Last in, I don't know. The judicial branch has been the topic of discussion very much in recent years, so who knows? It feels like often when people are arguing that you got to go out and vote, it's not as much, hey, you got to get the best possible representative or the best possible president. No, we have to worry about who is that president going to appoint to the courts. Are they going to put a bunch of liberal judges or conservative judges on the benches? That's often been the big argument when people are like disaffected and really don't care. Sometimes the judiciary is one of the things that gets people out there to vote when they're indifferent to their local representative or their president. They're thinking about the judiciary a lot of the time, which that's kind of crazy. And maybe that I would say that maybe that's more recent, but I think that I don't recall when this video came out. Hold on, let's take a peeky poo. 2015. So, you know, that was one of the big arguments that was made during the during the 2016 campaign. That was a big one in the 2020 campaign. I don't know how big of a conversation it was in 2012. I don't recall. But we might just be about to shift more towards focusing on who's going to be on the bench at this point when he's making this. It's always a
and
conversation,
in the eyes of many
but
people, least is the judicial branch. The job of the judiciary, also sometimes called the courts, which I'm going to call the courts because judiciary is really hard to say, is to interpret the law, to explain what it means. Article 3, which describes the courts, is even shorter than Article 2. It has only 3 sections instead of 4, and the courts today don't really look like this description. Here's the first sentence of Article 3, Section 1.
The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish.
At least the framers realized that the entire United States would probably need more than one court. But notice right there in the sentence that Congress has the power to create all other courts. And this leads us nicely into the second important concept of American government, checks and balances. Yeah, that was a segue right into it. It was a nice job by me. I'm going to need a little help explaining.
we've already talked about like one kind of degree of checks and balances within the legislature, kind of the two different branches of the legislature already kind of check each other. But this is probably going to be talking about more between the three big branches. Like, what do these three do to kind of keep any of the others from having too much power, like an uncomfortable amount of power?
Checks and balances. So let's do that part in the clone zone. Checks and balances is a confusing term because it implies two things, but really it would be better to think of them as checks that balance, although that might be confusing to people who actually try to balance their checkbooks. Anyway, the point here is that each of the branches has the power to limit or check the other two, and this creates a balance between the three separate powers. In the same way that the Constitution lays out the legislature in the greatest detail, it also gives the legislature the greatest number of checks on the other branches. Legislative clone?
So the framers of the Constitution were really concerned about the president becoming a tyrannical figure a la King George III. That guy was a jerk. So the Constitution gives the legislature a lot of power over the executive. The House of Representatives can impeach the president. Then the Senate can remove the president from office, but only if 2/3 of the senators vote for impeachment. The Senate can also check the president's appointment of judges and officials by rejecting them. This is known as advice and consent. Either branch of Congress can investigate executive activities and officers. If the president vetoes a law, Congress, with a 2/3 vote in both houses, can override the veto. Congress can also refuse to pass laws that the executive wants, and probably most important, they can refuse to appropriate funds for executive programs.
And the power of the purse, very essential there. There's the executive veto, which is a very interesting thing that we see a lot more now than we used to. Like when it was established, the veto was a very rare thing. Andrew Jackson was one of the first presidents to aggressively use the veto, and he was bashed for doing that. It was seen as something that you should do very sparingly. And it's like overriding the will of the people by kind of like overstepping Congress. And he was often called King Andrew for doing that and for other reasons. So today, the very liberal usage of the veto is not something that would have originally even been imagined back then. Like the amount of time. They probably expected it to be used far more conservatively.
You might think that since the judiciary is the third and presumably least important branch, Congress would have fewer checks on it, but that would be wrong. Here are the ways that the legislative branch can limit the judicial branch. Congress can impeach and remove judges as it can do with the president. Congress can be a bunch of jerks sometimes. That's me.
They don't do it very often, though, so...
The Senate can reject judicial nominees, which is a check on judges before they even get there. Congress can change the federal court system by adding or taking away courts like it says in Article 3. And it can change the jurisdiction of federal courts. Congress can pass new laws that override Supreme Court decisions as long as the decisions aren't based on the Constitution. Don't want to do that. No. And as a very last super drastic resort, Congress can propose amendments to the Constitution as it did with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, overruling the Dred Scott decision.
Wow, legislative clone. It looks like the framers were so scared about an all-powerful super president that they gave
the other
Congress
one
most of the power. Executive clone? You know what? I'll be executive clone since I'm basically president of the clones. The executive branch can check the legislature in the following ways. The president can veto Congress's laws so that they don't go into effect. The president can call Congress into special session, but he can't...
Sorry, I just have to point this out. this is something I think of as like the Obama hand, because I was politically awakened during the Obama years. Uh, but it's more of a Clinton thing. I think he was one of the earlier politicians to do it. Holding his hand like this instead of pointing. In this case, he's holding a pen, but like often when doing speeches, politicians will hold their hand as if they're holding a pen and kind of wag it at the people they're talking to because they deemed that pointing was too aggressive. Finger pointing makes people uncomfortable. So that's where the Clinton hand and the Obama hand seems to come from. Though I want more finger pointing.
Congress's laws so that they don't go into effect. The president can call Congress into special
All right, I just
session,
thought that was a funny
but he can't
thing.
make them pass new laws. The executive branch carries out the laws and may do so in ways that are contrary to what Congress wanted. Although this rarely happens, the vice president is given the power to break ties in the Senate, which is one of his only real powers other than embarrassing the president. The president nominates Supreme Court justices, and this can change the way the court works. He also nominates federal court judges, and this shapes the entire court system. The president can pardon people convicted by the courts, which cancels out their judgments. The president can also, in his capacity to carry out the laws, refuse to carry out court decisions. So you can see that even with the number of checks that it has, the executive branch is weaker than the legislature. But not as weak as the judiciary branch.
It's weaker than the legislature if the legislature has its stuff together and is able to actually come together and make a decision. A divided legislature, however, is not the most active. So, it kind of depends on the makeup. I feel that very often the power of each branch, it really depends very much on the occupants. Very often we have periods in history where a lot of the focus shifts from like the president to the Congress, though rarely to the judiciary because they're different in the way that they run government and do what they do. It's kind of like an outlier among them, but between the executive branch and the legislature, there are periods where historians focus more on the executives, but there are other periods where the executive isn't really where the action's at. It's the Congress. Clearly, the actual answer to this whole thing is that there's a lot going on both sides, but sometimes you'll find that the action is concentrated in one place a little bit more than the other.
Many political scientists consider the judiciary the weakest branch because without legislative and executive action, it doesn't have a whole lot to do. Being the weakest branch, the judiciary also has the fewest checks on the other two branches. Here's what it can do. The judiciary checks the legislature by declaring its laws unconstitutional. The Chief Justice presides over impeachment trials, and sometimes he gets to wear a special robe when this happens. Perk of the job. It's a perk of the job. It's really nice. And the judiciary checks the executive branch by declaring executive acts unconstitutional. A really good example of this was Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer. Super important case. Look it up. Look it up. The court also issues warrants in federal crime cases, and again presides over impeachment trials in the Senate. But the big check that the courts have is invalidating laws and executive actions. We'll talk about how courts actually do this and where they got this power in a later episode. No, I'll talk about it in a later episode. Now, okay? Let's go back to the regular desk. You're out of order! Thanks, Clown. Now, some of you are probably saying, Craig,
he also has that power to declare things out of order.
Information, but why do we have checks and balances in the first place? To you, I say, stop talking to your computers. That's weird. I also say, let's go to the thought bubble. So the framers of the Constitution were terrified of a tyrannical central government that would destroy people's rights like they felt the British had. The powers of the national government are separated, and
Sorry, I was just looking at the Union Jack. So this is... I wasn't sure if this was supposed to take place during the American Revolution or not, but it probably isn't. This is post-Revolution because this is like the version of the Union Jack that came a little later on. It didn't have the... It had like the English cross, which is the one that goes... It was... top to bottom and left to right, but it didn't have the diagonal red crosses.
government that would destroy people's rights like they felt the British had. The powers of the national government are separated, and each branch is able to check the others because this makes it more difficult for the government to act in ways that harm the rights and interests of the citizens. One of the best explanations of this comes from, you guessed it, the Federalist Papers. In this case, Federalist.
So the Federalist Papers are not actually legal documents by any means. They're just this collection of writings by Publius is the pseudonym used, but it's the team of writers: Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. Some other people also came in to write some stuff that pretty much none of it got added. The bulk of it is those three. They're not legal documents, but they're often used as kind of the reference for what the founders were thinking when they wrote the Constitution. They were there to, like, this is the arguments they would have made at the time, though it kind of leans towards the segment of founders who are cool with increasing the power of the federal government. It doesn't necessarily represent all of them, but they still are one of the most important series of documents when it comes to interpreting the Constitution.
51, which was written by James Madison, who also wrote a lot of the Constitution and became president. So he kind of knows what he's talking about, and really it's a shame that he's not on our money, because then Americans would pay him more attention. They would also pay him, literally. In Federalist 51, the title...
So James Madison, he wrote less of the Federalist Papers than Alexander Hamilton did, but a lot of people argue that he wrote the most important ones in a lot of ways. Like, when you're studying these, you'll often spend a lot more time on James Madison than Alexander Hamilton's writings, though Alexander Hamilton was a great writer. I think James Madison, he was killing it in the Federalist Papers. That's why we spend so much time on his writings, despite him having so much less than Hamilton.
Of which also contains the phrase checks and balances, Madison wrote,
"But the great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature?"
That's right, he wrote with an accent. Don't know how that's possible. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Madison was talking about checks and balances. I'll leave it up to you to decide if human nature requires that we build safeguards into our government to protect us from our leaders. But Madison thought so. And I think so too. But this isn't about me. This is about government. And it's helpful to remember that when people tell you that the framers of the Constitution were infallible, James Madison actually thought that they were outfallible. Or just fallible. Anyway, see you next time. I'm so fallible. Crash Course Government.
James Madison was very different from John Jay and Hamilton in another way, that he was the only one to kind of become a Democratic Republican, which is which actually leaned towards, like, the smaller federal government generally. You know, there's some flaws with making that, like, as a broad statement, but the Federalists generally bigger government. The Democratic Republicans generally more states' rights centered and limiting government power. Like, if we're speaking in very, very broad terms. So I guess with James Madison, he was cool with expanding the federal government's power, but only to a point. Hamilton especially was probably would have been cool with it being a little bit bigger than it ended up being. But I don't want to put too many words in his mouth without a proper citation. That seems like it would be kind of rude. So that was cool. Next time we do this, I don't know when it'll be, we're going to be talking about federalism, which is a fun conversation. A familiar term. We've talked about the Federalists, the political party, but we're going to talk about the idea of federalism, which has some relations to it, but it's its own complex concept, which refers to the balance of power. Well, I guess we'll get into that when we do. So We did 2 and 3 today. I don't know if we're going to be doing these every time. We're probably going to only do them every once in a while. But I'm going to try to get around to doing a couple of these every so often for a post show. Because I want to get a little further into the series. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting stuff. He's throwing stuff, sorry. So thank you all for watching. Let me know if there's anything you want me to check out on next week's post show. I don't know what it's going to be yet, but we'll see. So thank you once again for supporting the channel for another month. And I'm going to have some more stuff for you pretty soon. I'll try to get around to more Red Dead Redemption 2 as well. I don't really have a schedule for recording that yet, but I try to get something out every so often. All right. I'll see you later.